Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on planet Earth. These global conversations from the Earth Institute program initiative on communication and sustainability are for everyone around the world, so I can't assume a time zone here. Today's discussion, Fridays on the Sustain What webcast are devoted to the media, social media, news media, and the complex challenges we face in a fast-changing world. Mostly we've been discussing COVID-19 and the infodemic around the pandemic. Obviously, today we're on to a different frontier, one which I've been focused on for more than 30 years. And formerly at ProPublica for a little while, I worked with Abrahm Lustgarten, who's here today to discuss really innovative new frontier in journalism, which is when science journalism isn't just reporting on science, but integrating science into the news process. Really interesting project, and it's great to have you with us today, Abrahm, from ProPublica. Where are you in the world? You're in the Berkeley area, Oakland?
Yeah, just north of San Francisco,
Right.
Fairfax, California.
I just was on a call yesterday, and it was remarkable to hear that San Francisco has had only, I think, 58 deaths in this whole morass we've been immersed into, which is an extraordinary achievement, given it's a dynamic city with a lot of public transport and people and density. And from our New York area, it feels like quite an achievement given what we went through. How are you doing personally?
Oh, doing fine. The normal lifestyle impacts, but everybody's been healthy, and the people around me, friends and family, are all healthy. And we've seen our numbers climb, but nothing to the levels of emergency that you see in Southern California or elsewhere. So we're grateful and hanging in there.
And you've been covering the environment for a long time, and you're now deep diving on climate in a way that's remarkable. ProPublica is an incredible institution, nonprofit, able to dig deeply, able to incorporate data, and you kind of dove into a new project here. I'm going to show a couple of images to kind of get us going, and we'll be joined in a minute by a number of really interesting people. Hopefully, Bryan Jones, your colleague from the science side from Baruch College, who did some of the modeling, will. We were having a little bit of a technical issue, so we'll see if he can join us. But there's others who will be here who are focused on the same question. So we're in a world where people are on the move. It's a world where people have been. The human experience has gone from in 1800 there were 1 billion people, now there's close to 8 billion, and they are dynamic. We are moving all over the place, sometimes under stress, sometimes toward opportunity, and climate is changing, and climate is also turbulent. So what you've done here is a remarkable effort to deep dive into that really challenging sector of amid the dynamics moving people, the pull and the push of social and political factors and economics, and the pull and the push of climate experience and other things. So could you describe a little bit the project? I'm going to click into a way that we can explore it a little bit. I can zoom through that presentation a little as you talk. This
Yeah.
is the New York Times version, and you also had unbelievable photography from Meredith Kohut, which we'll see a little bit of here, and I'm hoping people will explore the piece online as well. So I'm going to click here. I think I set this up so I can go right into the feature. So what led you to this question among so many climate questions? You've covered methane emissions, you've covered many aspects of this, and here people on the move.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned it, my deep focus on climate is relatively new. It's just the past couple of years out of 20 years of environmental reporting, and so that can give me both a little bit of fresh perspective and maybe some naivety as well. But I'm interested in the big trends, and this has struck me. This issue of migration and geography and demography in general has struck me. As I've been reading reports and studies, as we all have, over the years of sort of spotlight issues here and there. The World Bank report focusing on human migration from 3 hotspots around the world. News coverage of the possibility that the conflict in Syria is linked to climate. And so we had this question of, what are the big picture systemic impacts that we can expect in terms of human population movement? What kind of pressures will that also exert sociologically on the planet and our communities? it really started with that question and digging into the state of the research on that issue, and quickly finding what the limitations are. That human migration is an unbelievably mind-bogglingly complex issue, as is climate, and you want to pair the two of them together, and
Right.
you've got a pretty weird soup of things to play with. And so recognizing those challenges and deeper complexity and nuance maybe than other things I've covered even, is great ambition to try to do our best to to draw a portrait of what the future might look like, or at least to map out what the issues are, in a way that gives an opportunity to not be reactive to to change after it happens, but maybe to be proactive about how we consider it now while we still have an opportunity to do that.
And how did you get to that point? I know from some chats we had, and I had with the scientists, you had met Bryan Jones, and you've been in touch with other scientists, including at Columbia, about this question. And then it's one thing to interview scientists; it's another to say, "Hey, can you work on a model for me?" So how did that transition from the traditional process of saying, "What are you doing? What does this mean?" to, "Hey, can you run something for me as a reporter?"
Yeah, it was a progression. It wasn't the conceit from the outset. I mean, there were some months spent reporting on this issue in the way that I think that any magazine reporter would begin to, looking at hotspots, looking at research, talking to researchers, and out of that arose kind of my own little dream of well, what if why can't we use some kind of data analysis to look at where people will go, and and have something more predictive? And what I quickly found out is that that's much harder to do than we might think. That the data that you'd need to do that doesn't uniformly exist. That the models, which I barely understood before beginning this project, can't necessarily do that. So my ideal, which was essentially to create like a computer-based looking glass that would read the future with some certainty, was out of reach. But through that process, we found that what the World Bank researchers had done was a big step in that same direction, and that there was an opportunity to to carry it a little bit further. That Bryan and other researchers had already been thinking about doing what we proposed to do, and it was just kind of a thought experiment. We actually weren't even sure through the entire process that we would use the results in our story, or where that would lead. But we're pretty excited to begin that experiment about a year and a half ago.
Yeah, and there was this World Bank, as you mentioned, Bryan, and again, some Columbia scientists had worked on this World Bank earlier initiative, but that was all about internal migration, like within countries. And I think the big step forward that you were taking was international, to add the cross-border connection. And let's see, I see Bryan here. Let's see if he can. We had a little trouble earlier. Bryan, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Andy. Can
Oh,
you hear me?
awesome. Yeah, yep, working great.
Great.
So, Bryan Jones, and thanks for coming on today. You're at Baruch College. Your background is in sort of human dynamics and climate dynamics, that mix.
That's correct. That's right.
And I was just showing the slide of the World Bank 2018 report on groundswell, which was sort of a foundational element leading toward what you guys tried together. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And you might have missed it when you were logging in, but Abrahm was talking about his growing awareness of the challenges here in looking at not just climate dynamics and where people live, but at what makes people move. And luckily he decided to keep digging in and not just throw up his hands and go, "This is hard." So how, from your standpoint, how did you kind of engage? Was there trepidation in engaging with a news operation to do a model design, or is this? How did that feel? That we were just talking a minute ago from Abraham's standpoint, how he kind of came from talking to scientists to the idea of working with a scientist. So maybe you could tell your story from your end.
Sure. Of course, there was a bit of trepidation. One concern, and this came up during the World Bank work as well, is the story as it plays out to scientists as they're going through the process of carrying out the research is often quite different than what the journalist might feel is the most newsworthy climate. In particular, a lot of the stories you see out there uh, really like to latch on to these single big numbers. X number of people are likely to move if the worst case scenario were to play out. And from a science perspective, those numbers are fraught with uncertainty. It's very difficult to say with any sort of confidence that we know exactly what number of people are going to move as a function of climate change. In no small part, Andy, because as you mentioned earlier, the process of untangling the decision, the migration decision itself, is so difficult. And climate is often acting through various other factors that cause people to take the decision to migrate. So at the most basic level, there's already some definitional issues as to who counts as a climate migrant, who doesn't, and what is the appropriate way to really keep score. So again, and I apologize for the technical issues. I don't want to rehash anything that you've gone over already, but there were a number of other really important points, I think, that came up during the process of the World Bank work that carried forward. And as Abrahm and I worked through this, which was again a learning process for both of us, I think some of the key points came out in the graphic you've got up here. One of those key points pertains to the spatial distribution of change that takes place as a function of both internal and international migration. And one thing we're able to do on the science side that I think is really important in the messaging is say something about that spatial pattern, particularly when all of our models, and I should be clear here that we ran multiple models to try and account for some of the uncertainty on the climate side. When all of the models agree on a specific location as a hotspot, then I think we've got something that's a bit more concrete than, say, this total overall average number of migrants. These are places, and you can see them here, the hotspots of in-migration, are places where policymakers really should be looking because we feel fairly confident on these points where people are going to be going or where they're going to be coming from. And to try and wrap up, to getting back to your original point, working with a journalist on this particular project, certainly it was different. I can speak for myself that there was a learning process that went into that. But at the same time, I think this conversation is so important that there was a lot to be gained in a partnership like this and generating the kinds of conversations to make this process a little less daunting, a little less frightening, and perhaps a little more advantageous to the regions likely to be both sending and receiving migrants in the future.
And swinging back to Abrahm, ProPublica's whole mission is outcome-oriented journalism in a way. It's accountability, historically, I think, is the big driver there. But also, there's a big chunk of what others call solutions journalism in what you do at ProPublica. I think it's fair to say. In other words, just reporting the story, writing a great story about sea ice or something is fine. That's a big chunk of what science journalism used to do. But this is different. I think you're using this process to try to identify ways forward. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think better than most. First of all, the challenges that go into trying to think about what accountability or investigative journalism means when it comes to climate. Investigative reporting is usually retrospective, and I think we all hope that when it comes to climate, we can do something that helps make the world better and doesn't just fight about how it got bad in the first place.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, in the 90s, I wrote a story about the future of New York City's water supply. It was going to be a big special report for the New York Times. And it kind of was shrinking because an editor was saying, isn't this a little ahead of the news? And I was thinking, wait a minute, isn't that what we want to be a little bit? So I'm glad that you're able to still think prospectively. It's good.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's exactly it, and it might seem controversial to some, but this is in a way, accountability in advance, right? I mean, you have an issue here that enough people recognize as an issue, but it isn't mainstream. The general public may think, my impression is the general public thinks this is something that, if they're aware of it, they can't do anything about, or it's not time yet to do something about it. And this is an opportunity to explore, the importance of the present moment. There's, I think we'll talk more about it. I mean, the model's utility is in showing the difference between pathways and not the precision of the results, but the differences between pathways, and our responses is pretty substantial. At least, the model suggests that it is, and the time to begin to adjust to those, future impacts is right now. And so I think from a journalistic perspective, the opportunity we saw was to explore that. I mean, we're learning through COVID right now. I mean, what the consequences are of having, a catastrophe that is predictable and was predicted and not doing anything to prepare for it, or preparing inadequately. And this is analogous in a way. From an accountability perspective, I mean, that's our goal. However, muddy the waters might get from there on out.
And the other key thing is you've done this. The work you're doing here helps to compartmentalize what sometimes seems like an overwhelming climate crisis story into its actionable components. In other words, there's stuff that can be done now, as you were just saying, as Bryan was saying, in cities that will be receiving cities. By the way, everyone should just Google for receiving cities. This is like a new term in the adaptation world, normalizing the reality that we're not going to be stopping emissions instantly. Climate change is not going to stop. So what do we do in the meantime in these areas that are under pressure of various kinds? Being anticipatory is a really important part of the story. Let me bring in some of the other guests here who I'm sure are eager. Louise, the points we already mentioned relate to Louise Lief's work, who's been, she writes and studies and consults on that interface between journalism and science. And I'm sure you were fascinated to hear, is this as novel a project as it seems? I know there have been others. The New York Times has had some modeling projects on COVID-19 where scientists are working with them directly. Louise, is this a dissolving wall that we're seeing here? Or
Well, there have been a number of projects throughout the country that have partnered scientists with journalists. Some very interesting things going on in Cleveland and on lead and on public health issues and elsewhere. The problem that we've seen is that they're all being done in isolation. And since each one is being done on its own, they have to work through what the protocols will be. How do these two different partners work together? And it takes a lot of time and resources. I was so glad to see this project, and particularly what I liked about the ProPublica, about your presentation, is that you mapped out how the process worked and what the decision making was, and what the concerns were, and what the safeguards were put in place. I think while there have been projects like this elsewhere, I think it could be greatly amplified. A lot more can be done if there's this kind of mapping process that goes on as these projects are taking place. These two communities have so much, scientists and journalists have so much in common and so much to offer each other. And the scientists excel at gathering data and pattern recognition, and the journalists excel in putting it into a narrative storytelling that's directly relevant to people's lives. I think if they work together more, they can really strengthen each other and have a big impact on civic life.
And does that feel that way, Bryan? I'm going to ask you, I know this work is complicated, and it was important to hear you mention multiple models. I'm going to show a slide in a minute about something related to COVID-19, where what I call single model syndrome can be an issue. The press latches onto whatever's new, right? And that's think about COVID-19, how many different bumps in the road there have been in coverage, surging around one thing and then the other thing, and it's hand washing, no, it's aerosols, and this model says X, and punishing the London model. And I was describing with others the peril of single model syndrome among the media. So that I think if you look carefully at the story here, Abrahm has written in quite a bit of the qualifier language you would want, that this is not the future. These are scenarios, and there's complexity behind them too. So that seems to be an important part of it. Let me also bring in here Ángel Muñoz from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society here at Columbia. There are other people who work with Ángel who've been working on some of the models with Bryan. And Ángel is separately also very focused on climate and migration, including in Central America. So, Ángel, could you describe your reaction reading the piece and thinking about this journalism science interface? What comes to mind?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity of being here. And yeah, I think I met Abraham back in December. Remember, we had a nice talk about this, and yeah, we have been doing, the kind of work that we do at the IRI has to do with that, precisely that interface between climate observations and predictions and society, like generally speaking, like climate and health. So we have started exploring a few ideas in terms of the so-called climate migration. And because of a big project that we have at Columbia University called Act Today, Adapting Agriculture to Climate Today for Tomorrow, we needed to pay attention to a few of these very important things that are related to food security, of course. And my journal, I'm super happy with what the work that Abrahm and Bryan did. I also second, I echo Louise. They have made an amazing work in terms of explaining very clearly all the complexities, because indeed this is a very complex field, and providing even the material, explaining what is the methodology behind all this in a way that people can also follow. And I totally agree with Abraham and Bryan. This is, from what we have seen and other teams have seen, this is a very complex problem. And I would say, in our experience, for the particular analysis that we conducted on the Guatemalan migration of 2018, we definitely see a climate signal there. But definitely, as I said before, it's important that we have all the context in place. And this is, Guatemala is a very particular place, well, Central America in general, but Guatemala, as probably people know, went through a 36-year-old 36-year civil war. And that brings, migration don't happen just because one day you have a pulse of something. There is always a context. And as Abraham and Bryan explained very well, it's not only about climate. When we talk about climate migration, it's not only about climate. It's a very complex thing, and I can talk a little bit more about that if you want. But I think that I applaud this effort of the journalist community, getting their hands directly on the data and having those interactions with the scientific community, and going ahead and explaining things with the as you said, Andy. We need to be very careful in order to understand the context, and also not using only one model, or not thinking that only climate or increasing temperature is the main driver here. I agree with Bryan. We cannot say, oh yeah, by this year we expect this amount of people migrating from A to B, because modeling is more about the different scenarios that we can have.
And one other thing that maybe it's worth exploring with you and Bryan is the climate variability and climate change. One thing I've tried to do as a journalist is not assume everyone has a common definition even for the words climate change. Even the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the 1992 treaty, and the IPCC, the main climate body, have completely different definitions of climate change. So if we're not specific about how we use these terms, it can make all kinds of messes. And El Nino is involved. Central America is really complicated. Maybe just the climatic picture, let alone the social picture. Maybe, Bryan, how does that play out too?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And from the onset, the very onset of this work, we decided it was going to be really important to try and at least incorporate some of that climate variability into the modeling approach. Right? And that's why we selected data from different GCMs to essentially drive the sectoral impact models that went into determining which livelihoods were most likely to be impacted by climate change. So, a couple of points are really important. It's the variability in climate is such that there are some places in Central America where we feel quite confident in the directionality in terms of temperature and precipitation, and there are other regions where we are quite uncertain. And this played out in our outcomes, where you saw regions that we were under one scenario receiving, from one ensemble member receiving migrants, and under another we were sending migrants. So those complexities are really important to encapsulate. And one way we do this in the modeling is to then not look at climate change in absolute terms. Does the temperature go up? Does precipitation change? We actually look at it in relative terms. And we take every location and say, how are we looking at changes relative to the historic baseline? Whether or not they're driven by what we would determine to be global climate change or not. So you mentioned El Nino, right? We see regular cycles of wet and dry periods, particularly throughout the western parts of northern Central America. And we were able to incorporate those factors alongside the climate factors to try and get some feel for the uncertainty in outcomes that's related purely to the climactic side. And I'll stop by saying the uncertainty on the social side is something we have even less working knowledge at this point in time. It's going to require a lot of thought going forward. But certainly there are issues there as well.
So Abrahm, I forgot to mention this is part 1 of 3, right? So
that's right.
We're on an epic journey here.
We're going deeper.
First of all, how soon are the other parts coming along, and can you give a hint of what they're about?
Yeah, for sure. At least the next one I can. Within the next 2 months. And the next piece is to really look at some of this demographic and geographic change here in the United States. So really, a different issue from, how developing worlds will respond and the importance of aid, and just looking at how, the places we're most familiar with here in this country are going to change, and what people's response to that is likely going to be. The third piece is to, in some way, to look at a little bit of the flip side of this coin, which is, what's the opportunity for growth that comes through the movement of people, both societally, geographically, environmentally.
Well, one thing I think you get at in the story, if I remember correctly, I don't want to be sure I'm not conflating it with the World Bank report, but one of the big arguments, well, let me back up. It seems like human dynamics are kind of like a plumbing system. There's pressure, and if you heat up something, the pressure pushes people in a certain direction. And if the North invested more in development in the South, for example, in job opportunities or resilience, that's one way to mitigate pressure to move north, as opposed to just building walls and the like. But here, ideologically, that's been a tough sell. The State Department budget has been shredded. The budget for walls is growing. Is that part of this too, the landscape as it relates to policy?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Ángel and Bryan and Louise, we'll get to some of these other questions related to journalism again in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And Bryan can probably talk about, how that breaks down in terms of the model. But a big component of this effort is to look at how, development scenarios and geopolitical scenarios interact with climate. And I'll say at the outset, I think there's an assumption beginning this reporting that we're only talking about, movement of people northward, and cross-border migration. And one of the most surprising things that we found through this work was the effect of what happens, if you restrict that movement. And because of the way the SSPs are built, you can't necessarily isolate, just closing borders as an effect, but you can look at the things that go along with that. And it generally means slower development, less aid, a less stable geopolitical process in the surrounding region, and a less stable government in particular countries like Guatemala. And again, our work gives us really broad strokes, not a lot of specifics, but it suggests that people will really struggle in place if their ability to move as an adaptive response is limited, and it corresponds to sharper population growth and less development and less wealth, all at the same time that we know that food insecurity will grow, and crop production, at least with the current crops, becomes more challenging. And that's really, a recipe for a different kind of humanitarian disaster. And by the end of our reporting, and even quite recently, that had started to look like the worst case scenario to me. Not the destabilization of mass movement of people, but what happens if we can't move at all.
And this gets to this broader landscape of complexity, and how do you cover systems as opposed to stories? I'm going to bring in Patrick Keyes here, who I didn't know about until, I guess, was it just last year, Patrick, or 2018, when he was the co-author, the lead author on a paper on what's called Anthropocene risk. And having been involved in this idea of the Anthropocene, a human-shaped planetary future, since 1992, I latched onto the paper for that reason, and then realized it's a wonderful description of the fact that all of these big issues, how people move related to climate, how we respond or don't respond to COVID-19, are systemic. Every one of them, and reporters. One reason we've created the initiative at Columbia on communication and sustainability is to try to foster systems thinking among reporters. So it's a hard story. Patrick, welcome to our little clatch here.
Thank you.
And I'm going to shift to this for a second so everyone can meet you. The last time you were here, early in this journey called Sustain What, you had a toddler on your lap.
Yeah.
I think, Abrahm, you said you have the risk of a toddler on your lap.
They might be on my lap soon. So
Yeah. Yeah, we were, the last time Patrick was on, we were talking about complexity and COVID-19, the pandemic. And so, Patrick, I'm going to go back to the slide briefly so you can describe your analysis of whether it's the Middle East and the arguments about climate being a driver of violence and disruption there, or here, these other issues we face in the Anthropocene. They're implicitly systems issue. You press on the balloon over here, and it gets bigger over here, et cetera. And has that been received well in the science process? And it does seem to have lessons way beyond geography.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is communicating what's most important about this concept of thinking about what's unique about systemic risks in the Anthropocene versus, say, systemic risks in some previous time period. And we can debate what the Anthropocene means, maybe not today or right now, but the point being is that we find ourselves at a time right now where everything about our systems, our Earth systems, our human systems, are accelerating in terms of the pace of change. The conditions to which society is tuned are accelerating. Our societies themselves are moving more quickly, they're more connected, et cetera. And all of that really changes the nature of how we have to consider risk and how we have to consider systemic linked crises. And I'm not sure that has really percolated through. There's been a bunch of papers on this topic. It's not only exclusive to this Anthropocene risk. There's a lot of work in this space. But I think climate migration is a perfect focal point for thinking about what's the scope of the question that we're talking about right now. Is it acute? Are we thinking about the next 5 years? What assumptions are being made about the system boundaries? Anytime we talk about a problem, ask a question, or try to answer a question, we define some boundaries conceptually, heuristically, scientifically. And I think that being in this time of the Anthropocene, we really have to interrogate where we are placing those boundaries explicitly or implicitly.
And again, this isn't just abstract stuff, because
No,
governments
no.
make decisions about where to invest, like we were saying earlier about how much you invest in the State Department versus the Defense Department, or border security versus fostering better opportunity in other countries, USAID and the like. These are multi-billion-dollar questions. So Louise, though, you know the newsroom, right? And at any time I've tried to report on complexity, it's sort of a yawn. There's this, well, where's the front page thought? And Abrahm knows this very well as well. And I don't know if there's a way to normalize this, or, ProPublica is hard. It would be great to think of it as the norm in journalism, but of course it's very exceptional and still rare. And we're in a world of shrinking journalism resources right now too. There was a grant that helped to support this. So does this feel like a little window into a very neat corner of a giant landscape that's collapsing, or does this feel like a new
Oh
opportunity, a
no,
new
I mean,
frontier?
there's so much potential here. It's just a matter of recognizing it and then having the ability to act on it. I think one thing that you mentioned earlier is key, that you trying to teach journalists how to cover systems rather than stories. The beauty of scientists working with journalists is it marries those two things. If you just have the stories, if you just have the anecdotes, you're not going to give your public the ability to say, well, what do we do about this problem? You're just stringing together a number of stories, and it's important that they know about that. But the systems approach that the scientists can bring can open a window to doing that and marry it to solutions journalism. Because at the end of the day, what the scientists want, what the journalists want, is some action to come out of the hard reporting that you've done. And that's the kind of thing that is possible to do. I think a useful model for the journalists are not as far along in this because the newsrooms and the scientific establishment are not structured in a way to make working like this possible. Plus, there's the added pressure on resources, and there simply aren't boots on the ground. But a useful model to look at is the way scientists have been working with communities. That is much more extensive. There have been a lot of partnerships between those two, and they have had to hash out many of the same issues that newsrooms, that ProPublica and that Bryan and Abrahm had to hash out about what can we say, how can we use this? How can we use this information? Isn't it too reductionist? And what are we going to do with the information? They have they're much further along this road than the journalists in terms of mapping out processes and protocols and how you work this way. And I think the journalists can learn a lot. So I think it's a huge potential area for journalists to explore, and that they would benefit a lot, and scientists as well.
There's one other element I want to ask maybe Bryan about. Bryan and Abrahm, and Bryan, you referred to this before. Not only do you want to do multiple models, but here you have the opportunity because of pretty good data on some aspects of people's movements. It's iterative. In other words, your model today will not be the model a year from now, because you're actually, unlike with climate change, which is on these giant scales of time, you can have data that's helping you correct and refine the model going forward. But journalism is still about the story in a way. You're here, even though it's a 3-part series, it's still a magnificent structure that will be published and is done in a way. The conversation going forward feels like there's still a bit of a disconnect between that norm of journalism and how science works, which is constantly iterative and testing and questioning. Does that feel like an opportunity or a problem?
Well, I hope it's an opportunity. You're absolutely right. I mean, speaking from the science side and how the folks at the World Bank who have been involved in this kind of work and others who are doing this kind of work is we see it as iterative and moving forward and kind of building little by little on what we've done before. But the ultimate goal here is to help inform a conversation in a productive manner, one that we hope can be more of a success story from a societal perspective, right? We don't want this to turn into the crisis that many seem to believe it could be. And what we're trying to do, and the reason there's such urgency in the scientific community, it is we believe we can avoid that outcome. And we hope that journalists, and I believe they want to be our partners in this, and we think that there may be a real opportunity here for a productive partnership that helps us to take a situation that some have painted as a potential crisis that could change the world for the worst and turn it on its head. We're going to have to deal with this one way or another, no matter what we do on the climate front, right? We're locked into a certain amount of climate change, and there's going to have to be an adaptive response to that, and that will include migration to some point. It's the degree to which we can make that a positive for everybody is, everybody stands to benefit. The United States stands to benefit. Europe stands to benefit. Developing countries stand to benefit, including those in Central America. So there's a lot of positive things we can do here, and that's where I hope that this relationship continues to be iterative on into the future to help us get the message out. There are things that policymakers and we as people can do to make this hopefully turn into a success story.
And Abrahm, we're going to, in a week, let's see, August 6th and 7th, we're doing workshops, briefings for journalists in Latin America, and actually Central America mostly, in Spanish actually, on forest management issues in Guatemala and in Central America. It feels like there's a ripe opportunity here to help integrate what you've found so far and maybe going forward with journalists in these regions. You both mentioned the importance of having applicability on the ground and salience. That comes in two different ways from big publications like the New York Times Magazine, which press on the public sphere in a certain way. But if this journalism can be integrated more with boots on the ground reporters in Guatemala and Salvador and Mexico, receiving countries and countries with struggling economies, that feels valuable. Is there something? This is like normally this time in the webcast, I try to move toward next steps, and I do think maybe there's a way to hold a briefing or have a workshop around this to see if you can expand its utility in those countries. I'm just throwing this out there. I hadn't even thought about that before this point until 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that it begins with, on a local level, recognizing, that climate is one of the forces at play here. I mean, I spent a lot of time reporting, in the field, actually long before, our modeling work was anywhere near complete. And some of the people that I met and spoke with in terms of, subsistence farmers in these small communities, would talk about the weather and climate explicitly, but many didn't, and they didn't quite, articulate that as one of the forces driving their, the severity of their experience. And so I think on a local level, bringing that into the conversation and recognizing that, there's lots of complex things in Guatemala. I mean, for example, as much food insecurity as the country faces, it actually produces an enormous and growing amount of food, but most of it's exported for us and for, and for Europeans. So to begin to acknowledge that to support, an indigenous community and, in a local community, you have to recognize the ways in which varying climate extremes are making it more difficult for communities that once took care of themselves in terms of their food supply to not do that anymore. The same can be said for forestry. I think that's a critical part of the conversation, and there's lots of practices that are connected to this. I mean, throughout Guatemala, I saw, deforestation with the goal of creating income from the forest supplies, but it increases the amount of heat exposure for the land and wound up making it impossible to produce the same food crops that they might have in shaded landscapes, on that same land, which exacerbates the root causes of the problems we're looking at. So, having that conversation locally is critically important. I mean, the GAO just came out this week with a report on USAID's actions, in Guatemala and elsewhere, raising issues about, the variability of the aid we've supplied. And we cut off some of that agricultural aid in 2017. And we might be restarting some of it now, but I can tell you with certainty, I mean, these villages that I spent time with in Guatemala, their suffering would have been dramatically reduced, if not reversed. My anecdotes might not have existed were that USAID program not cut short the way it was in 2017. And it's such a concrete example of a specific place and a specific dollar amount, where my anecdotal lead is starving because their corn crop failed, and the USAID program was pumping money into a drought-resistant plant to replace maize in that same region. And had they had that crop, my subject wouldn't have moved to Houston, Texas. And so to try to integrate those conversations that way, I think is a great way to start that locally.
So Ángel, that brings me back to my sort of next steps question, which is here maybe about.
Oh, we lost him.
Can't hear you.
Well, I think I know where he's going, so I can start like talking a little bit, but I don't know. Are we still live?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
sorry,
you're back.
I accidentally left the studio. That's not a good thing to do. No, so I was going to say, well, yeah, you could talk amongst yourselves. In other words, what could we do together? Act Today, we at Columbia, we have a substantial multi-year project that's significantly about integrating knowledge and data, not just with journalists, but with practitioners on the ground. The World Food Project is involved with Act Today as well. And so is there something building on this ProPublica package that's sort of the interface of journalism and data and the modeling effort that we could work on?
Sure. Yeah. Let me actually, answer that one. Going back to one of your previous comments that I don't know if you really discuss in depth about climate change and variability. So very quickly, it's not the same. Changes in climate in general is not the same that climate change. Climate change for a typical climate scientist means something very specific related to increasing CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and natural climate variability that you were also mentioning. I think is the most important climate piece in all these Central American migrations. Not all of them, but in several of those that we have been discussing here. So something I would like, before I actually answer to the concrete next steps that we might be able to address, because those are related to natural climate variability, something that I would like to say is that what we found is that there is not very clear to say maybe there is no climate change signal in the migrations that we have been discussing in Central America, at least in the Guatemala 2018 one. Because those, as you guys were mentioning before, are more related to actually a multi-year drought that we had during the 3 previous years to that 2018 migration. And El Nino and La Nina are actually a key important component of the natural climate variability. So part of what we do at the IRI is to better understand those different complexities between the different climate drivers like El Nino and La Nina, but there are several others. And if we put all the eggs in the climate change basket, the kind of decisions that we make moving forward, the kind of next steps might be very different than if we actually focus on El Nino and La Nina. So something, as I said before, very nice is that the team used several models, but these were climate change models. And no model, that's why they're called models, no model is perfect. And there are several well-recognized biases in these models, especially if I want to use them in order to make actual decisions on the ground, and I only use the climate change component, even if most of them are agreeing, as it was discussed before, that doesn't mean that they are going to be able to reproduce well the characteristics related to ENSO, which usually might bring drought, not necessarily drought, but might bring less rainfall than usual. So rainfall is actually connected to these rain-fed agricultural activities that are so important in Guatemala. And of course, they are related to these migrations that we're seeing. But as I said before, once you weight the different factors, climate is there, but it's not perhaps the most important. That's why I'm so careful when I talk about climate migrations. Abraham has been talking about climate extremes and climate, and I like that. But we need to be very careful in terms of next steps. If we identify the main driver as climate change or natural climate variability, because that actually defines the next steps. And it's not the same climate change as changes in climate, which is what I think we're talking about here. So indeed, Act Today has been creating these amazing spaces for discussion between the Federation of Farmers and the farmers themselves and the National Met Services and the ministries and decision makers in general and scientists to be able to, through a dialogue that has been also, we have had a lot of help from other institutes and partners. You mentioned the World Food Program, the SIA Biodiversity Alliance. What we have been trying to build together is really understanding the context and what can we do today? That's why it's actually called Act Today, rather than what might happen because of the long-term trend on climate change signal at the end of the century. We are living these things today, and climate change has a component there, but most important is the natural climate variability. So I don't know, I'm going to stop there. I have a lot to say. And, but I think that, it's very important it's very important to be precise. And I know that people understand climate change and changing climate as the same thing. And as a climate scientist, I just wanted to clarify that because the next steps are very different if we're talking about CO2 levels in the atmosphere, or if we're talking about what can we do and how can we better prepare for variability in El Nino.
Well, and that gets back to what I've learned in 33 years of climate reporting. It took me a while I started to understand and feel that we would have been better off in a way if there had been an intergovernmental panel on climate vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly.
Than an intergovernmental panel on climate change, because climate change including the IPCC, the definition is just this a very technical definition. It's climate changing because of any force, human or otherwise, and then you get into the details. The Framework Convention, the treaty, the Paris Agreement as well, only considers CO2-driven climate change. So you're right, the policy landscape, if it's focused too much on CO2, and as Abraham's story reflects, you know, even an aggressive reduction in CO2 doesn't change the dynamics on the ground in this region for decades. So you got to do stuff now. And if people are seeing this headline and not reading the story, or seeing anything about the climate crisis and not really digging in on those details, they miss the stuff that's actionable now. And I think that the story does a good job so far of laying that out. And I'm glad there's 2 more parts coming and a lifetime of Abraham's journalism ahead as well. So that feels too like an opportunity to me, building the conversation. And maybe Louise, you could weigh in on this too. Is it part of journalism's job now to help build the conversation around its content? Or is that someone else's job? The New York Times has suffered terribly recently because they let the conversation about their content go on social media rather than engaging directly with it. Is that a part of the solutions part of journalism?
Well, what's new and different, and again, in the way that scientists and journalists can help each other, is they're 2 actors in a much larger information ecosystem now, and they have to interact with all sorts of other players. I think when they work together and play to each other's strengths, it's a force multiplier. They can accomplish a lot more. And if, like me, you're focused on what is the impact of science in civic life, what is the role of science in civic life, you can really advance that ball. Specifically, what I'd love to see happen is the community science movement, where scientists work with communities on a problem. Let's say on some of the problems that Abrahm talked about is their corn crops are not growing. Right. They're in this desperate situation. What do? How do they figure this out? Those sorts of things are happening globally now, and thousands of projects in the United States as well, to add a robust journalism component. The journalism component has been absent. The scientists and the communities are working on these issues, whether it's flooding or air pollution, where the community has asked a scientist to come in saying, we know we are in trouble, we're having a problem, but we don't know how big it is, we don't have any data on it, and we don't know what to do about it. That is a natural pairing for both scientific, journalistic, and community collaboration. What it does, it strengthens both the journalists and the scientists in the public square, and it anchors them there, and it creates a closer relationship between those parties and the communities they serve.
I'm showing an example here of the American Geophysical Union,
exactly.
Which for about 7 years now has been running this nascent experiment called Thriving Earth Exchange, which is a Match.com for Earth and climate and ocean scientists, tens of thousands in AGU, and communities with risks and problems, landslide risk, chronic flooding. It's still nascent. I think there have been 150 projects in a world that needs thousands. And just even thinking about Central America, it's an enormous challenge. I'm really glad that Act Today model at Columbia has that integrated, what can we do for you conversation going. And that's happening, by the way, in Bangladesh, as well as in, not even within that project, but separately. We're trying to integrate cyclone prediction better with people in Bangladesh who will be in key positions, decision makers and communicators. So journalism, of course, I'm biased because I ran a blog for 9 years. I developed a blog at the New York Times called .earth that was implicitly a conversation. And I'm hoping maybe sometimes as a group, as a community of journalists or journalists and communication folks like me, we can help to build the conversation around important journalism innovations like this one, which is what I'm trying to do here today. And Abrahm, I guess for the last minute or two, it'd be great if you, and maybe Bryan first, and then Abrahm, if you had a last thought about next steps that could help to do some of this integration and sort of getting the great power of that story, but then also getting at the complexity and opportunities on the ground. What could we do next, even like next week or next month, to keep this going forward? Bryan?
That's a tough question to answer.
Or are you like ready to duck and cover now that you've done this?
Yeah, no. Well, I've had those urges at times.
Sure.
From a scientific perspective, there's an awful lot that remains to be done, and the reality is, we're never going to be able to knock or check every box on the wish list. There's simply not enough time. There's simply not enough funding, and perhaps most importantly, the data we need to do so are just simply not there.
Right.
You take on a project like this, and you often learn that there are many more questions than you thought on the outset, and you leave, with more questions in the back of your mind than you began with. So it's.
But that's good, right? That's part of the process of science, right?
Almost certainly. I do think it's really important, again, and I'll speak to the scientific community, and about this type of model in particular, which is a very aggregated top-down type modeling approach, to think about ways that we can better connect the work we're doing to policy, along with policymakers, engaging policymakers in conversations that I just don't think happen enough between that world and the scientific world, where journalists have an opportunity to act as a medium of sorts. I think that's a piece that I think we are struggling with a bit on the scientific side. And personally, because of the particular type of modeling approach that we took here, it can be challenging to kind of connect the work we did to the policy world. So there's some technical work from a scientific perspective I'd like to do to really work on expanding the models to include more information that is directly related to household level decision making, to make some of the work we're doing more actionable from a policy perspective.
You just reminded me of one more element I might show. I just did a conversation here Wednesday with Jeff Sachs, the longtime Earth Institute director, who's now at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and who they're running a project called SDGs Today, which is the Sustainable Development Goals Today, and they're trying to create a dashboard, a live dashboard, so that you can have a place to look and gauge the 17 goals. There's 6 overarching themes. The ones that are relevant to mobility and migration are there. This is taking a little time to load, but it feels like one useful way to think about next steps would be to have that sort of dashboard possibility. And again, that's way too big for ProPublica on its own. It's way too big for a Baruch College modeler on his own, or Louise Lief to architect how journalism works. But it feels like directionality is there in everything we've just been discussing, moving from the story to the applicability, and from the story to impact where it's needed. Well, that's what I just said. And then getting comfortable with systemic realities and iterative realities. Abrahm, I promised you the final word, so I'm going to give you the final word. This has been a great and gutsy step by ProPublica and by you. You have a lot more work to do, obviously. But what do you think after this hour that you didn't think before this hour?
Well, I think I've learned a lot, in the build up to this conversation, as well as in this conversation about, what some of the delicate touch points are, when it comes to reporting on how climate change affects these issues, the specificity of the language, the specificity of the research. But and that's always a valuable lesson. But I think, take a step back from that and to get also at some of the points that Louise raised before. I mean, the marriage of journalism with this kind of work, I don't think that it has to be as separate as is implied. And I think that the journalism can be as iterative as the science, and often is. I think history is iterative. And we as journalists have a mandate to tell a story, to come up with a narrative, and also, regretfully, for lack of better language, to sell that narrative. If you want people to read it, and you want people to pay attention, and you want that conversation to really have legs, and all of that brings a certain complexity to distilling complex ideas into simple or possibly oversimplified thoughts. But I think there's a utility in that, and I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. That it's a one-way street or flow of information. I think that can be helpful. I spent time at the AGU conference in San Francisco last December where I met Ángel, and if there was one overarching message from all the presentations I heard and all of the concerns across the disciplines there, it was a frustration with communicating the scientific work that was being done to the public, and with the public understanding of the depth of research that happens out there. And so this is an opportunity or an effort to try to bridge those gaps. And specific facts are critically important in journalism, but the bigger picture, I think there's room for some experimentation, and basically we weren't afraid to be wrong, in doing this reporting. Try to acknowledge that up front, for the sake of having that conversation and trying to have it on a simpler, more accessible level. And in terms of next steps, there's lots of specific policies, aid, things we could talk about, but from a journalism perspective, I think next steps is to have the courage to continue to do that, to be iterative, maybe to be mostly right, partially wrong, and to provoke that conversation.
Those are skill sets that are vital in a period of complexity and consequence and rapid change. So thanks a lot for playing along and for doing what you're doing. I'm a big fan, and of both ProPublica and you. We had ProPublica Illinois on here recently, talking about how do you sustain local coverage in a global pandemic, even as journalism's model implodes under the pressures of this pandemic. So this was great. I'm going to do a closing comment and say that on Sunday, every Sunday from 10:30 to noon, we do a session here that's designed to depressurize, to focus on the arts and on our hearts, songwriting and poets. So every Sunday, 10:30 to noon. And then Monday, we're going to get into a new realm that's like this as well. Thriving Online is Mondays. They're more what you can do. And I'm going to be examining the virtual reality AI arena. There's a digital storytelling lab at Columbia that I only discovered a month ago. This is how big Columbia is. It sprawls around. And Desmond Patton from the School of Social Work, who's using AI to study race and gang behavior, and they're going to be here Monday at 1 p.m. Thank you all for being here. Abrahm Lustgarten from ProPublica, Bryan Jones from Baruch College, Louise Lief from the Interface of Climate and Media. You can find all their information back in by scrolling back to the beginning of this webcast. Ángel Muñoz from IRI at Columbia's Earth Institute. Patrick Keyes, great to see you again, from Colorado State, and keep up your good work all around. Sustain What, which is what this has been for the last hour, is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. That's the surge that's playing out in Central America and globally. And of course, now we're in the great pause, as some call where we're at because of this virus. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment, and it's the reason we're able to connect here today. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide. This is a global conversation here, and I want to hear your feedback, get in touch with ideas. That scrolling bar at the bottom has ways to get in touch with me. And thank you again for being here today, my guests, and especially the people who tuned in. Thank you all.